Start the recording so that I don't forget to do that. Cool. So we're going to go live. I'm going to admit everyone. Good morning again, folks. I'm Jen Colby. I'm the co-executive director of the Northeast Pasture Consortium. I just wanted to invite you to our first session of the day. This presenter on succession strategies will be John Locke, who is a ranching for profit instructor and a longtime rancher in Texas near Houston. And John has a more extensive bio, but I'll just encourage you to read that bio so that we can let John get right into some of his succession strategies work. And then I also will just encourage you, if you're a person joining us on Zoom, to make sure if you have any questions to private chat so that to myself or Jess Williamson, and we can ask your questions. So thank you so much. And John, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen. It really is an honor to be with you guys this morning. I'm down here southwest of Houston. I think it's going to be 75 degrees and sunny all day today. I didn't get a chance to look at y'all's weather, but hopefully up there in the Northeast, y'all are enjoying something similar. Sorry for that if you're not. So talking about farm and ranch succession and succession strategies, it's a big deal. You know, if you've been to any kind of an ag summit or workshop over the last 20 years, we've been talking about this stuff a lot. And there's a good reason for it. Part of my foray into, I guess you could say, non-conventional agriculture after having been in agriculture my entire life and being a sixth generation member of a ranch here in Southeast Texas stemmed from a really big succession event. And so that was in 2010. We finalized it. It started in 2007 and it was rough. And what I'm going to talk to you about today, most of that's going to stem from my personal experience. Some of it's going to stem from the people that I get to work with, being a member of the Ranch Management Consultants team all over the country, RFP alumni, as well as executive link members. So what is it about succession that it's such a big deal? Maybe we've been talking about it for the last 20 years because we're looking at somewhat of a generational turnover in agriculture. But I'll ask you this question. Of the people who want to pass the ranches on intact to the next generation, I'll share this stat with you. It's estimated that 30% are successful. And that's pretty scary because I know that all of you guys, whether you're first generation, fifth generation, sixth generation, you're passionate about agriculture. You want to see agriculture and you want to see the small farms succeed. Well, if we're operating with a 30% success rate, that's a big challenge, right? And so we all know, many of us, the struggle to build a successful business, period. And you can take that struggle and multiply it by about 10 when you're talking about let's build a successful business and then let's pass it on to the next generation. And then let's have that generation set up well enough to where they can pass it on to the next generation. I saw a stat in doing some research that only 12% of successful farm and ranches make it to the third generation. Well, why is that? Poor communication and planning. Let's face it, not many of us got into agriculture because we like people and we like dealing with people. There's so many of us that we just want to be out with our animals. And maybe it's not just that we don't like it, but we've never been put in situations to where we need to develop those skills on communicating with people. Planning is one of the most basic business fundamentals, good planning. And to be honest, many of us don't have the skills to plan properly. So we can't create a succession plan if we can't create other kinds of plans in our business. Heirs and owners are incompetent. Now that sounds like a really ugly statement. We all know brilliant people in agriculture and they're not incompetent. but they are incompetent when it comes to things like running a business, building a business, working on big picture strategic stuff. We all grew up learning how to farm and ranch from our ancestors or from mentors. We learned how to do the things that we enjoy doing, like building fence and moving cattle or planting crops. But those things are not going to ensure your success in business. And this is a big one. This is the biggest one to me. Too many times the business isn't viable. If we don't have success, it is very challenging to have succession. Most farms and ranches in the United States and North America are operating at an economic loss. And if they're operating at an economic loss, then it's pretty tough to pass them on to the next generation. Knowing how to raise livestock is not the same thing as knowing how to run a business that raises livestock. All right, so what's the big deal about farm and ranch succession? Why is it so important? For many of us, we see the business and its success as our entire legacy. We put our blood, sweat, and tears into these businesses. We work our entire lives to build them and to maintain them. So if we cannot successfully have someone to come behind us and succeed us, we consider that a failure. Much of our businesses are tied to a particular piece of property, maybe a herd of cows. And if that's the case, like I said earlier, we are passionate about seeing agriculture succeed, seeing small farms and ranches succeed. And to many of us, if that piece of property gets broken up because of a succession event and that ranch ceases to exist, that appears to be a massive failure. And obviously, we want to see our children have the best chance for success. We want them to have it better than we did. Maybe to a fault. A lot of times we got where we were because of the struggles that we went through. And sometimes our kids might need a little bit more struggle than what we think. But at the end of the day, we want to leave the world, we want to leave our ranches, and we want to leave our businesses a better place for our kids. And so that's why we feel so strongly about successful succession. So one of the biggest problems that I see in dealing with other ranch families, and a problem that I saw in dealing with my own family, it's hard to talk about. And what actually happens is we don't talk about it. We had a succession dark cloud hanging over my family for 20 or 30 years. Well, guess what? Nobody talked about it. At the end of the day, did that make it easier or harder to work through? Obviously, it made it a lot harder to work through that. And this is completely understandable. There's no doubt that there are many reasons that make this stuff hard to talk about. And I'm going to challenge you guys, if you're dealing with succession, this is the number one thing you need to think about. How are we going to start the conversation? What do we need to do to get the ball rolling? So there's a lot of things, a lot of reasons why this is so hard to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the previous generation from their standpoint, but things are going on in their heads that make it so hard for them to bring this subject up. Let's face it, it's not a fun thing to think about our own mortality. And if we're talking about what's going to happen after we're gone, we have to consider the fact that one day we're going to be gone. But none of us are going to get out of this life alive, are we? And so we need to address that. We need to start to consider our mortality, and we can't let this be an excuse not to talk. There's a pretty good chance that our personal financial situation is not where we would like it to be. If we're that previous generation, I guarantee you that there is no one out there that doesn't have the best of intentions. They think about their vision for the future. They think about where they're going to be 10 or 20 years from now. They think everything's going to be rosy. And there's a pretty good chance that we haven't done what we've needed to do. Maybe it's circumstances beyond our control. things that have kept us from getting to where we want to be. So if we're in a financial situation where things are tough, and all of a sudden we need to start thinking about how we bring someone else into the ranch or how we pass that ranch on to the next generation, there's a lot of shame associated with the fact that we're not where we want to be. Like I said, the communication I mentioned earlier is a big issue. We don't possess the skills, most of us, to have those crucial conversations. A lot of ranches, there's tension, there's resentment when the family's working together. And those things have been built up for sometimes for reasons we've never even considered throughout the years. And we just don't know how to navigate that resentment and those emotions that have occurred. And that just adds a whole nother layer and a whole nother challenge on even starting the conversation. We have no idea to make it fair to everyone. If we're dealing with multiple children, potential multiple heirs, if we're dealing with maybe on-farm and off-farm heirs, we see many situations to where the on-farm heir is looked at as if he's the golden child and everything's great. You get to work on the ranch every day. You get this fantastic lifestyle. Meanwhile, if you're the on-farm heir, you're working 80 hours a week for little to no pay, maybe not fair market value. And you're looking at the off-farm heirs as they haven't made. They've been able to chase their dreams. Meanwhile, you have mom or dad that's their grandpa or grandma that are sitting here looking at the situation, trying to figure out how they can make it fair to each one of these parties. Once we do something, for the most part, it's final. And like I said earlier, this is the way we see our legacy. This could be our entire legacy as we see it. We don't want to mess this up. And so in our minds, one of the ways that we can not mess it up is we can not do anything at all. And then we all know what happens when we do that. We make it harder and harder to deal with, and we actually mess it up. So what if you're the next generation? What if you're the incoming generation? You're in a situation where you really need to talk about the future and what it's going to look like. That's very difficult. And this is the one that I definitely identify with because I've been in this situation. We got to do it twice. We got to talk about succession with my dad's generation. And then immediately when that was over, thank goodness, we moved straight to succession from my dad to me. And it was a hard conversation to have. And one of the biggest reasons why it was hard to have was because we don't want to come across as being ungrateful. We've been given this great opportunity to come back and be a part of the family business and try to help carry on the traditions and the legacy. I mean, what more could we ask for? Why do we really need to know what the plan is for the future? Why do we really need to know what's going to happen with the property, with all of this value that we see around us? And sometimes just initiating that conversation period can make you feel very ungrateful. Like mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, we also did not possess the skills to navigate through those crucial conversations. We have that resentment sometimes, whether we know it or not. We have so many emotions that have taken over from the past, and we don't know how to go through that without everything blowing up and coming to a head and building up to a point to where maybe we say things that we can't take back. We're not sure how to do what is right for our family while still honoring our parents of the previous generation. This is a big one. This was a big one for me. It's really a challenge to figure out what we want or what we need for our family and how we can dovetail that into ways that we can honor the previous generation and try to them. Another fact is that we may not know what we want or what we need. We live in a society to where a lot of times it's considered selfish to think about yourself, about what you want or what you need. In agriculture, especially in ranching, we're used to getting by on very little. And we just keep working, keep our heads down, keep on trucking. And we've never stopped to think about what we want or what we deep down, we may be afraid that we are not competent. It's a scary thing when you're talking about going from working in the business to working on the business, from being someone that's low man on the totem pole to running the whole operation. Many times we know that we don't have the skills to run a business. And so we feel like it's better off just to let things happen organically. And maybe the best thing to do is just to not talk about it. Business viability. I said this was the number one thing, the number one reason why people don't find success in succession. I don't think that you can have a discussion about farm and ranch succession without using Joel Salatin's famous quote, "The ultimate test of sustainability is romancing the next generation. If our farms aren't fun and our farms aren't profitable, our children won't want them." I had a sad conversation with a good friend of mine not too long ago. He's a first generation rancher. He's built a monster of a ranch and a wildlife operation. He's put his blood, sweat, and tears into it, invested a ton of money. On many levels, it looks like a successful operation. His son's graduating from high school and he's going off to trade school because the last thing he wants to do is come back to the ranch. It's been nothing but suffering and work and not enough pay and not enough profit. Right? And so the ultimate test of sustainability is romancing that next generation. If there's not success, should there be succession? I think that this is a big question we need to be asking ourselves. And in my friend's instance, he thinks that that ranch is set up because it's big and it's got some scale and it's got enough going on to create some cash flow. But is it ultimately successful? If he passed that on to his kid, would it be a blessing or would it be a curse? Most farms and ranches cash flow, but they operate in an economic loss. If we don't start to consider the economics of what we're doing, if we're just living in a cash flow and a financial world, a lot of times we don't know what is really happening with the big picture on our ranches. And that's one of the first things. If we're going to treat these businesses as real businesses and we're going to build real businesses that will be a blessing to our children or to the next generation that's coming behind us, we have to start to understand the economics of what we're doing. Success is not just about profit. Work-life balance and purpose are also important elements. And I've already talked about that as far as work-life balance and working too much and not having the ranch be a blessing. But I think purpose is another one. We need to consider if this is a viable business, it needs to serve someone other than ourselves. And so here's some advice for the outgoing generation, some general advice when we're talking about succession planning. I think that the outgoing generation needs to understand that the business or the asset is yours to do what you wish with it. I started that difficult conversation after my dad's generation had completed their succession planning, and the time was right to move into our succession planning. I wanted to make sure that my dad understood that I felt like the business, the assets of the business were his. He inherited them and he could do whatever he wanted to with them. And that's hard a lot of times for that outgoing generation to understand and to come to grips with. But I think that it's very important. This is one that's kind of hard to hear too, but you do not owe your kids anything. You do not owe your kids anything. We live in a society where inheritance means so much. And your level of success in life is often judged by how much you left to your heirs. That's not always a good thing. You do owe your kids certain things, but as far as assets and money and inheritance, this goes a little bit back to that struggle that many of us go through. Sometimes our kids need a little bit of struggle, and sometimes we need to let our kids be independent and understand that they need to make their own way. So at the end of the day, you do not owe your kids anything. It is impossible to build something that lasts in perpetuity or to manage from the grave. So you need to focus on the best that you can do just for the incoming generation. There is no way to manage from the grave. And I have sat down with people that have built these operations, and they're OCD type people, and they like things done this way and this way. And part of the qualifications of who is going to inherit their business is they have to agree to do it like this. Well, guess what? When you're gone, it's really not going to matter. So focus on that incoming generation and do the best you can. Have a plan for retirement, for role, control, and money. There's so many of us that feel like our retirement plan is the funeral home. I love this business. I want to stay in this business. I'm a rancher. It's my entire identity. Well, that's going to create some issues for you when you start talking about succession. If you need to transfer control from yourself to the incoming generation, you have to have a plan for that. You have to have a plan for how much money you need to live on. You can't create these plans just based off hoping that things are going to happen organically. So many times we find that our homestead or where we live is in the middle of the operation, and this is everything. And if that's your identity and you don't have plans to transition away and into something else, you're going to see some real challenges with succession. If you ever want Junior to step up, you need to plan for it. My suggestion is to start small, but go all in on those small things. You see situations, and I was pretty much in this situation. I had the whole ranch turned over to me. That's a scary thing for a young man. And I didn't have the skill set and the knowledge to do it justice. It was a lot of learning on the fly. And, when I say start small, I'm talking things like give Junior one enterprise to manage. Let him do all of the planning, all of the financial planning, all of the buying and selling that's associated with that enterprise. Once you pick that enterprise, maybe it's a particular piece of property or a small part of the ranch, then you need to go all in, and you need to give Junior the autonomy to be able to make those decisions and learn from his mistakes. Do not be so focused on leaving your heirs fish that you neglect to teach them how to be fish. So many times we see families that they say that if we can just get to this number of cows, if we can just get to this level of production, then my family should be set. My heirs should be set. And so many times we spend all of our effort and everything trying to get to that level that we forgot along the way we need to do the teaching. We need to help those kids understand why we're getting to this level, how we're going to get to this level. We need to let them be a part of that, make their own mistakes. So don't worry about leaving your kids fish. Teach them how to be fishermen. This is a big challenge that I'm going to challenge each and every one of you with. This is a tough one. You need to define your legacy. You need to define it as if it has nothing to do with physical assets. In the beginning, I said that part of the reason why we put so much effort or so much, we think succession is such a big deal is because we see that as our legacy. Well, what is your legacy? If it's a particular piece of property, if it's a particular herd of cows or particular physical assets, that's going to be a challenge for you, right? What if that falls apart? What if you have urban encroachment come in on your business and you're looking at property that's $50,000, $60,000 an animal unit in your area, and it's almost impossible to ranch? And you have instilled in your children that this piece of property is our legacy. That could be crushing for them, but more importantly, that could make them make bad decisions as it relates to their business and relates to their lives. One of the legacies that I see for myself and my family is my succession plan. I went through a succession planning workshop not long ago. I went with the intentions of just learning more to help other people. And I realized that I'm 42 years old, 43 years old, sorry. I've got 3 young kids. I'm looking at succession in about 20 years, 22 years. I need to have it finalized. I need to have the transition having already taken place. How I do that and in the way that I build this business between now and then is going to be part of my legacy. So define your legacy as if it has nothing to do with physical assets. So here's some advice for the incoming generation. Your first and most important responsibility is to your immediate family. I mentioned that earlier, and sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow because we might feel like we're doing things that aren't honoring our parents or the generation before us. But that is your most important responsibility, and you need to keep that at the forefront. Spend the time to figure out what you must have, what you want, and what things will cause you to walk. Understand that your parents owe you nothing. If you're brought up your entire life thinking that you're owed this ranch or you're owed this business, it's going to put you in a different spot than if you understand that your parents owe you nothing. You've got to make your own way. Be proactive, start small, and challenge yourself to develop the skills necessary to build and run a business. Be proactive. A lot of times you see parents' frustration with Junior not wanting to step up. And on the flip side, you see Junior very frustrated because he's not given the opportunity to step up. Well, if you're frustrated, I would ask you, what things have you exhibited to show the generation before you that you're ready? How have you gone about that? Sweat equity must be accounted for. Some people say there's no such thing as sweat equity. Well, there is sweat equity. You either need to be paid fair market value for your work, or you need to document the difference. That difference needs to be figured in to the succession plan. Hopefully there's going to be a decision made at some point. No matter what that decision is, you need to accept it with humility and move on. Because remember, your parents owe you nothing. So here are the big ones. This is basically what I'll close with for the talk portion before the question and answer. This is general advice for success. Build a real business that is economically profitable, serve someone other than the owners and employees, promotes a healthy work-life balance, and is operated by people with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. If you don't have an organizational chart for your business, I would challenge you to look into that and build an organizational chart with effectiveness areas, position agreements. We teach you how to do that at the Ranching for Profit School. If you have clearly defined roles and responsibilities, that can be a fantastic segue to go into your succession plan. Maybe you have Junior as a technician on your org chart. And if you realize that 10 years from now, he needs to take over the entire business, and he needs to be in the CEO role, there is going to be things that he needs to do, skills that he needs to develop to be ready for that opportunity. It's a little scary to just think that one day we're going to wake up and organically he's going to be qualified to run this business. The biggest challenge is the value of property. So we're going to build a real business, and we're going to operate this as if it were a business, and it's going to be economically profitable. Separating the land business from the livestock business is paramount. If we have non-farming errors or off-farm errors that we feel like are going to be figured in the succession plan, and you have this massive value in a piece of land. If we separate the land business from the livestock business should be economically profitable enough to be able to lease the land. So that's a way to have value passed on to off-farm heirs and still benefit from the inheritance from the generation before. Also, separating ownership and management. Those things can go a long way to mitigating the imbalance in land and business value. We're talking about separating ownership from management. That goes back to the org chart and these clearly defined roles and responsibilities that you have for your business. We have a fair. It's the last week of April where I live, and it's a great place to go to see some mighty fine hogs. That's about all the fair is good for. So you need to understand that there is no such thing as fair. My family historically thinks that if you're born into the family, you get an equal share of the business. If you've got 4 kids, that's 25% to each kid. Well, it's worked up until this point, but a pie can only be cut into so many pieces. And I see both sides of the argument. Many times you would say, well, it's not fair if my kids don't get an equal share. Well, is it fair to the kids that stay on the ranch that are actually challenged with operating this business? If they get the same share as the heirs that are off the ranch, or maybe they come back at a much later date and time, I would challenge you to throw the word fair out the window. Start with succession planning and then base your estate planning off of the succession plan. We really haven't talked about estate planning versus succession planning, but succession takes into account the entire business and how we're going to transition, how we're going to have the talent in place to keep the business going. Estate planning, we're talking about assets. And if you get this backwards and you divvy up the assets, then you go back to the drawing board and you say, well, I'm going to create a succession plan. What happens if those assets were misplaced? And if that makes it impossible to complete the succession plan. So make sure to start with your succession plan and then worry about your estate planning and make your estate plan fit your succession. This is a big one. Hire professionals to help you. I don't think there are many people out there, no matter how successful they are in their business, that are qualified to navigate all of these things on their own without professional help. We talk about estate planning, and it's very obvious that we need accountants and we need lawyers involved. There's tax and legal implications to all of this stuff. And that's a no-brainer. But when you're going to sit down with your family and you're going to work through these things, you really might consider hiring some professional help to come in and facilitate, people that are trained in dealing with these emotions and some potential resentment that might exist to help you get through it. Involve everyone appropriately. You don't have to involve everyone initially, but everyone needs to know what the plan is. But at the end of the day, when I keep saying you don't owe your kids anything, the one thing that you definitely, absolutely do owe your family is clarity. And so it would be relatively irresponsible to create this succession plan, and I see it happen all the time, and say, well, they're going to find out whenever I'm gone. Okay. That's some people's way of dealing with it, and that could create some issues for your family. So good, bad, or otherwise, it's good to have everyone involved and to get everything out there and get your people together. And a lot of times having that facilitator there is one of the biggest things you can do to help that go smoothly. Okay, guys. Well, I hope I've at least given you some things to think about today. I'm going to turn it back over to Jen. I will say that she has threatened me with my life if I did not get through on time. Luckily, I'm one of the early ones. So I've been very cognizant of my time and trying to get through things in a timely manner. But I'd be more than happy to try to answer some questions or tell some stories. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jen. And once again, I really appreciate you guys for having me and let me visit with you today.
Thank you so much, John. That's that's awesome. I really appreciate it. And I know that everyone does. This isn't always what we talk about. So it's why we need to talk about it, right? Clarity. Right. It's all about clarity. So if folks have questions, I encourage you to be looking at the Q&As and doing some voting of those. I just wanted to start with a question about, you were talking about the incoming generation and being really clear about what they must have, what they want, what's going to make them walk. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? Like what are some examples of that? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jen. And I'll say that the reason why I bring that up is because it's always an afterthought for that incoming generation. It's always promised that come back, we need help, we'll squeeze you in, everything's going to be great, right? Everything's going to be fantastic, and we'll work it out as we go. And now being, coming home as a 22-year-old, that was the way it was for me. I think that's the way it goes for most people. Now being the age that I am now and having children and potentially having them come back or another young person come back, you could waste a lot of years of your life. And so I think that is a consideration that most people need to make before they make the decision to come back. Simple things like, how much money is it going to take for me to raise a family? What are my expectations and what agreements are we going to create based off of those expectations? If I'm coming back and nobody else in the family is, what's going to happen one day when those people want to come back? It's relatively simple, but in every situation, it can get quite a bit complicated. And I just think that it's so important that we need to be thinking like that. There's another thought out there that you shouldn't come back too soon. And we actually talk about this in Ranching for Profit. And I feel pretty strongly about that as well, that sometimes when that younger generation goes away and they go do something else and they get some experience, maybe in a different industry or maybe on a different ranch or different farm, that gives them that time to start to think about the way they want things to work at home and what they would like to see whenever they go home. So
the conversation that we've been asking it too has been about succession, as in family succession, and being able to have those, whether or not we take the opportunity to do so, having regular conversations with between the incoming and the outgoing generations. How do you think things are similar or even different if they're an out of family transition of some kind that's not an actual succession?
Right. I think things are definitely different in that scenario. In some ways, it's a better scenario because it's easier to be more businesslike and to look at the nuts and bolts of it and to take some of the emotion out. But it's challenging on the other hand from the generation that's passing the asset or the business on, that maybe they don't feel that pull because of, this is my bud that's coming in to succeed me. And so I definitely think it's different. And there's going to be that bad side, that bad emotional side to it, that maybe I don't feel the same way about it. But I think the benefits outweigh the negatives. And I'll say that was one of my big epiphanies. I've got 3 daughters. They're 9, 11, and 13. And it's going to be challenging, but I know that for me to do this right, I need to consider that my business may be passed on to somebody that didn't start with my last name. And that might not be somebody that's related to me. And so I think if you can take that context and pretend like you need to pass this business on to somebody outside, you're obviously going to have some different considerations because of the relationships and the emotions and whatnot. But if you can start there, I think that that's huge.
Do you think that is also related to the roles and responsibilities question a little bit? And I was wondering, because you talk a little bit about the differences between sort of not differences, but roles and responsibilities and what those mean.
Definitely. And I think that that's huge. I think that's everything, because what typically happens is we need somebody because we need help. And this guy or gal has our same last name. And so we're going to just plug them in. And sometimes that's okay, but many times they don't have the right skill set. You need to consider what the business needs. And if you can afford to bring in someone with the same last name and give them the appropriate training, or you can take that hit and say, okay, well, we're going to pay them. We're going to consider the next 3 years as something that's it's going to be somewhat of a wash for the business, but they're going to get the training to where they'll be qualified to do this job. And if you take your business and you create a real business out of it, and you create an org chart with those effectiveness areas and those position agreements, that gives you the ability to do that. And if you look at my org chart of the business that I'm going to pass on 20 plus years from now, there aren't any names there. And when you typically see people sit down and do their org chart, they put so much effort into whose job is it, what person. And too often we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, or we're just leaving it open and we're saying, well, we need to do all these things and we have these people that can do it. And if you're going to be economically profitable and you're going to build a real business, you need to consider those things, and you need to take the names off of the roles, and you have to figure out what the business actually needs.
I'll just say my name is in a lot of places on my org chart, but they're just placeholders.
Right. And a great exercise is to consider what your dream business is, or what your business needs to be 3 years from now or 5 years from now, and create that scenario and say, okay, well, this is what I want it to look like. This is what it needs to look like. So how do we get from point A to point B?
Yeah. So I guess this is maybe a two-part question. So these are skills that we're talking about. So we're talking really about building skills. So where would you suggest that somebody start? Because this is a really overwhelming list. It feels like that. So if you could just suggest one or two things, and maybe places they could go to get some of that information, what would you suggest?
That's a great question. I can't highly enough recommend the Ranching for Profit School. I know that a lot of people find it a challenge to take a week out of their lives and go, and it is drinking from a fire hose. We're not talking about some of these basic things in that. You'll get a general overview of everything, but it will start to get your paradigms challenged to a point to where you'll start thinking in business, and then you'll start to look at your business and your life differently. I basically and challenge myself to read, X number of books a month, and pick up books. I think there's some great books like Crucial Conversations and Getting to Yes. You can't just let this stuff happen. You've got to be proactive. And a lot of that depends on what scenario you're in. Are you knocking on the door? Do you have kids that are already home and you need to step out of the business right away? Or do you have time to start to develop this plan You probably need more help, more hired help to come in if that's the scenario, versus how do we develop some of these skills ourselves? How do we start to look at this business differently and develop the people in the business differently? But just seeking out any opportunity to read or to go to a workshop, that's what I would challenge people to do.
Cool. Thank you so much, John. And looks like we've come to the end of our time. If folks continue to have questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. You can also reach out to John directly through the Whova app. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and we really appreciated it.
Thank you, Jen. We're right on time.
We are right on time. Look at us.
Y'all
Just because
have a
I stopped
great day.
asking questions. Thank you so much, folks, and we'll join you we'll see you at the next session at 11.